On this episode, Tyler and I welcome David Vaughn, director at ISSA International, to discuss supply chain risk management and all things cloud. Stay tuned.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
Welcome, everyone, to Below the Surface, the firmware and supply chain podcast. It's episode number 21. I want to remind everyone that Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you will find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our products in action, you can sign up for a demo, and you can get all that at eclipsium.com/go. Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us, filling in for Scott Shefferman. Tyler, welcome back to Below the Surface.
Yeah, buddy. Good to see you. And, not to dox you on air, but, it's that special day for you.
It is. It is my birthday today, and I'm celebrating by doing 2 podcasts and a webcast. So that's always working. Mr. David Vaughn is a seasoned information security leader with 20 plus years of experience. He's known for building and motivating high-performing teams, optimizing threat detection, supply chain risk management. His expertise spans leadership, team development, data analysis, and designing secure network infrastructure. He excels at communication, strategic planning, and managing people and resources for maximum efficiency. David, welcome to the show.
It's always fun to hear the bios of yourself, right? Like when you spend hours trying to make it brief and simple.
Happy birthday, pretty good sir. One, though. Thank you. That was pretty good, though. It was pretty tight. I like it.
I'd also like to say, we completely didn't know this coming onto the show, but the show sponsor being Eclipsium, that it's amazing because I'm a huge fanboy. I know that you work there, but Yuri and team, they're one of the few companies out there that I really just love watching their growth and the wins that they're bringing to market. So that's awesome. Shout out to them.
I mean, I'm biased. I can say nice things about Eclipsium, and sometimes I feel like Brown knows him, but dude, like I love working here. I love my job. Love the people. So it's been a great ride. It's also cool too. As we talk about this stuff, there was a recent post that we made that was done by the team that I want to call out as well, and that is like a history of network devices that have been compromised and or used for ransomware. And the team spent a lot of time on it. I mean, I really didn't have that much to do with it. I gave them a couple of suggestions and resources and reviewed it, but I was very, very hands-off with it. And it came out really, really good. And they started it, it's really funny. They started in 2005 with Mike Lynn. And I was like, oh my God, I remember that time. And there's things that I can't say publicly to this day about that whole thing that are hilarious that I'll tell you off air. But yes, it was interesting times. But David, our conversations today tend to be focused around you and I talking about supply chain risk management, but also cloud. And when you start talking about cloud, I was like, yeah, I got to trust that my cloud providers are doing infrastructure security well, that they're evaluating the integrity and security of their firmware and underlying hardware. And you were like, there's a lot more to the supply chain with cloud computing. So I want to open up the floor to you to kind of kick that off.
Yeah, and I get super jazzed up talking about cloud because it's so diverse and there's so many things that you could talk about. But the type of as a service offering, depending on what that service offering is, right? There is the shared responsibility matrix, right? Which is everybody's favorite key term. The downside of the shared responsibility matrix, as things shift left, right, you have less visibility, less control, less interaction with the things, right? So that's where the CSP will inherit all those things, and they don't always share that information, right? So when you start talking about things outside of my current organization, where there is a very defined set of requirements that are often confusing, and you have to bring in 3PAOs and all that stuff, right? And the private sector, a lot of people don't care about that, right? Because the benefit of using cloud is that I can focus on what it is that my company does, and I don't have to build a data center. I don't have to invest in infrastructure. I can only pay for what I'm using, right? And that's a huge win for them, right? So they don't necessarily care, right? I can remember briefing an executive about the infrastructure problem that he was going to have in regards to cloud. And he looked at me right after I explained to him the situation. He's like, I don't care about infrastructure problems. Like, this is an infrastructure problem you're going to care about, right? Because you're not going to have the ability to do anything about it other than SLA enforcement, contractual things, right? There's a lot of limitations that you have for enforcement of something that's gone wrong, right?
Yeah, I feel like this is in supply chain risk management, when we talk about software supply chains, right, this is the transient dependency problem. And there's a library that relies on a library that relies on a library. But here, what you're talking about in the context of cloud, David, is very similar, right? There's a cloud provider that relies on third parties, and those third parties rely on third parties. And we have to somehow be able to not just trust from a security perspective, but also rely on that from an uptime and performance perspective, all of those players in the supply chain.
Yeah, if you want to take it back to where things began, right? The Telecommunications Act of 1996 really spurred what has become cloud, right? Big takeaway from that, right, was that you couldn't be a services provider and an infrastructure provider, right? So they split up multiple companies. There was an impact with that, but the big thing was that an ILEC could not charge a CLEC, and for those that don't know, like an incumbent local exchange carrier could not charge a competitive local exchange carrier a premium for running their business or service on their infrastructure, right? So take those terms from previous days, right, and apply that today, right? You've got companies like Digital Realty, CoreSite, Equinix, right, where they are running the fabric of these cloud providers, and they can't charge the cloud provider a premium more than what they would charge any other company, right? So they're basically setting up companies on fabrics, right, that have enabled and lowered the cost of doing business as a cloud provider, right? That's really what makes cloud affordable, is the shared infrastructure. But it's also a huge risk, right? Because you got a major BGP issue that happens, it's taking out, a couple thousand companies, right, in a region. I think one of the things that I've seen a lot of chatter about was the new Netflix movie, Leave the World Behind, right? Everybody's like, oh, that's a horrible idea. Like, none of that would ever happen. But, the more you shift left as a organization or a society, right, you're putting multiple eggs in a single basket, right? You may think that you're working with multiple cloud providers, like cloud provider A and B and C, and sharing that across them. But at the end of the day, a lot of them are interconnected to each other by internet exchange provider companies, right? So, and there's not a lot of players in that market, right? So you've got to be aware of that risk. One of the things that you could utilize to your benefit, right, is SOC reports, right? That's not something specific to any one sector of business. If you're engaged in business with a company, you can request their SOC audits. Sometimes you can even get them without having to do business with a company. But what I'd be looking for as an executive with a company that was thinking about going down the cloud path is, are they identifying subservice entities, right? And what that means is, as a consumer of a cloud service, you are a user entity. The cloud provider is a service entity. Any company that cloud provider relies upon to be highly available, which is what you are seeking their services to be, highly available, cost efficient, right? Those entities are called subservice entities, and that is in scope for a SOC report. both a SOC 1 Type 2 and a SOC 2 Type 1, those are in scope.
But is SOC 1 and SOC 2, David, is that an internal attestation, or is there a third-party validation of the attestation for SOC 1 and SOC 2?
We could probably do a whole call on the differentiators in SOC reports, right? But ultimately, your SOC 1 Type 2 is going to be very rigid. The person that is providing the results of the audit cannot choose which elements to present to you. They are very rigid and well defined. The purpose, though, of that is really to give assurance of the financial solvency of a company. Now, when you get into the SOC 2 Type 1s and Type 2s, right, those are a little bit more beneficial for you on the security side because that provides their POAMs, where they're at, what they plan on mitigating, what they don't plan on mitigating, why, et cetera, right? So there's more juicy information for a security practitioner on the SOC 2 Type 1 and 2 than there is for a SOC 1 Type 2. But it's still beneficial, right? Because in both of those types of reporting, right, that information should be disclosed, and almost 90% of the chance it's not going to be, right? Because a cloud provider is going to argue with you that your authorization boundary starts and ends here, right? And everything beyond that is veiled under the shared responsibility matrix, right? That you don't have a reason to know. Sometimes they even argue that it's proprietary, right? They don't need to disclose what their infrastructure looks like, right? And in no other case is that more important than, you know, the government and defense sector, right? They absolutely need to know if you know, a provider that you're working with can't renew their lease to the data center that they're running, right? That would have a downstream impact to operations, right? So how would you find something like that out? You know, some people call it shadow IT, stuff like that, right? It really is just a subservice entity, right? When you start using that common lexicon and you say, hey, we've read your report, this is great, but we don't see any subservice entities defined, right? Who do you rely upon to provide highly available services to me? And that's a great, hard question to ask.
That is also reliant on the fact that the audit is done well, right? And the auditors doing those and the answers to those questions are provided in a valid context that is actually giving insight, right? I've been through a few of those audits, and you can interpret a question and or answer a question based on the auditor and or the information being provided, and that's still only processes, procedures, and people. You still have the underlying technology where we're running into issues, and at the end of the day, the executives don't even care. It's offloading their responsibility until we have something like a major breach at, say, the rack level. Like, I think until we have something that affects both downtime, availability, and the integrity of their data at one of these shared resource centers, not just a cloud provider, but a data center that has maybe multiple cloud providers in it. Until that happens, I don't think we fully understand the tertiary effects of the scope of the supply chain issue at that. I mean, you look at the mega rack one that Eclipsium released a little while ago, and team looked at that, like the impact of some of that and the ability to get on chip long term in something like a data center, and you know, what is their patch cycle and how are they doing it? All of those things, man, those have huge impacts that I don't think any executive is thinking about until it happens.
Well, I'll tell you, they're not thinking about it, Tyler, because that costs money, right? And at the end of the day, most companies, well, all of us talk a big game about being secure, being security first minded. Really, every company is about its bottom line. And the bottom line is, how do we maintain profitability, right? And how do we invest the things that we need to invest so that we can get by without any major issues? But how do we make money, right? Because every company is focused on making money for their shareholders, right? But you know, the simple thing that we just talked about with the SOC reports, right? That's an administration security control that you could use to your advantage. I love what Eclipsium is doing and working with Intel and their on-chip capabilities that are coming, right? But how do you write that in as a contractual requirement, or write that into a legislative requirement in multiple areas of the world. How do you create that as a standard where everybody has to do that? Right? Like that's beneficial to companies like you guys and Intel, right? But in the way things are today, I don't ever foresee that becoming a golden standard, right? And because of that, you've got to find all these other things that you utilize in your tool set, right? That's a big concern.
Still waiting for the verified by Eclipsium cloud provider logo. I think I would actually spend more money and use that.
Yeah, I mean, I know you guys are doing well, but why Eclipsium isn't like a household name in the data center company or the colo companies is mind blowing, right? Because what you guys bring to the table and what you can do to prevent risk for executives and VIPs, right, is pretty awesome, right?
And I think the privilege of David, preventing risk though is really about verification and then trust. And I think as we start to think about the supply chain risk management, and supply chain security and assurances, how do we verify these various aspects of the supply chain, right? Down to the hardware, down to the data center. Are they leasing? Is their lease expired? Down to their third parties and their third parties. How do we verify all of that and keep up with it to enough of a level where we're comfortable with, at least somewhat comfortable with the risk we're taking? I
mean, you also have chips and SDKs on top of that, Paul. Like, going back to that, like, keep it going down that rabbit hole.
Well, and Tyler, you and I have joked about this before at cons, right? Like, that's where people throw zero trust out there, right? But even zero trust, the concept and the paradigm shift that it is, you're still relying upon whoever is interconnecting the cloud providers, not only to themselves, but to their customers, right? It is the days of direct connecting to a cloud provider. Look at Netflix's model, right? Netflix has their content on colos all across the world, right? Those colos provide private CDN for Netflix customers to watch their content anywhere in the world, right? And that's a rinse and repeat process for most cloud providers or most CDNs out there, right? And in the days of having like a direct MPLS circuit to a company, they're just too costly, right? So the model of having an internet exchange provider, a vendor neutral organization that connects companies to themselves and other people to companies, that it's a huge business, but it's also an unspoken risk when it comes to zero trust, because at the end of the day, that's a trust that's happening either without your knowledge or somebody's veiling it under the shared responsibility matrix, right?
And that's thinking about the fact that they're doing not just their business right, doing security right, that they're patching the hardware, that they're not exposing those interconnects at a layer that is well outside of most people's even understanding. And then you add the aspect of things like BGP on top of that. Like, BGP is going to cause the next world war, I'm sure of it. And those interconnects are going to be the source of a lot of misunderstanding, because it's just not things that most technologists really fully understand, or how their cloud provider interacts at that level with things like the interconnects and where those flow pieces and information is coming from. So there's going to be a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and or confused people when that series of events does end up happening.
So, in my personal professional opinion, right, like in the commercial sector, the cloud providers, for the most part, the major ones, right, the big ones, are agile and resilient enough that they could withstand a direct impact to them directly. It's their underlying fabric, right, or the fabric that they're built on top of, that I think from a supply chain risk management perspective, I'm concerned about, right? Because not only is that something that is out of reach, out of visibility to the end customer, a lot of times that's going to be out of reach to the cloud provider themselves, right? It's going to take them a while to figure out that, hey, it wasn't something in our infrastructure. It was the underlying fabric that's supporting our our SaaS or our PaaS or our IaaS products, right? Not every single cloud provider has its own data centers, right? Some of these cloud providers, and we're going to talk about the Fortune 50 ones, right? There's hundreds of cloud providers out there, some of which don't own a single data center, right? They'll be in a colo somewhere because that's more cost efficient, right? For what they need to do. And the concern there is when you're in those colos, you're not necessarily aware of that because they treat that and label that as one of their quote unquote data centers, right?
Yeah, it might, immediate thought goes to physical security and who's your neighbors in those data centers. And the real conspiracy theorist goes to me like all of the data exfiltration things that we've covered on the show over the years where, LED lights and fan speeds and things like that can be used to exfiltrate data.
Or they just, have that 0-day that pops those edge devices that are all interconnected and shared. Yeah, there's software and SD-WAN and all kinds of stuff built on top of that, but the colo itself has software that runs, and when there's 0 days or they've misconfigured that and they have the ability to pull flow data off and or mirror, or someone's already doing that and that company is compromised. Again, you can run down the rabbit hole as long as you want. And that's not even getting into the SLAs for the hardware. You talk about things like Dell or Palo Altos or all those. They have maintenance agreements with companies that are third-party companies to them that go out and service these devices and interchange them. Yeah, they're probably background checked and cleared, but they're getting access into a data center. How long does it take, one of us to do something in there when they're changing out hardware or replacing a board or putting a board in that got compromised in the supply chain for shipping to that third party that's helping manage the warranties? The rabbit hole keeps going, and
it's not CDN hardware. It's kind of funny actually. When I worked at university, there was a CDN provider had some rack space, and I was like, those are just like Dell or HP server. They're commodity. They're not. Commodity they're not like CDN. It's not like CDN hardware. It's the big OEMs that are making that hardware for them. It's part of their it's part of their product line.
And that's what makes things fun. Like when you have regulatory requirements, right, that require 508 compliance, right, for accessibility, or you have requirements that you have to validate that there's no unauthorized companies hardware. I'll try to stay away from brand names, right, but there are sectors of organizations where they can't have provider X in that hardware stack. Well, how do you make sure that that's the case for all your third and fourth party providers, right? In my current organization, we can't actually do flow down clauses to a third party. So if we're working with a cloud partner, we have to have an agreement with them that the requirements that we have imposed on them, that they will then impose those same requirements on a third party, right? Which is complicated, right? Because if something happens with that third party, we can't go directly to the third party and say, hey, you screwed up. We have to rely upon the cloud service partner to have that difficult conversation, right? And that makes things fun because lawyers get involved and all that fun stuff.
Hardware is very difficult to validate from the supply chain perspective. In fact, when I have presented it in the past year or so, I've gone through there's hardware, and then there's low-level software, firmware, and then there's drivers operating system, then there's third-party apps, then there's open source software, right? And I think if you ever see me present that slide, the level of difficulty for validation starts off highest on the left, right, with hardware, and then starts to slowly move across where if you're creating your own software, I think it's a pretty well-solved problem that you can validate those libraries and validate your own software and more easily fix it than what do you do if you've discovered that someone has soldered something additional onto the board, right? Or removed a component, or any of the different ways to manipulate hardware. How do you discover that? You X-ray is there technology where you can X-ray, but you still need a clean, good source? Someone has it's almost like a fingerprint or a hash, right? A cryptographic hash where I've got the original X-ray scan, and if I X-ray scan it, it should match to make sure no one's inserted hardware in the process. Can we all go through that process? Probably not, but is that applicable?
I used to do that. Yeah, and I used to work at a Fortune 50 company several years ago where I ran what's called the IV&V lab. So basically, any company that wanted to sell their product into U.S. public sector, we did full stack IV&V on their hardware, both from pulling random systems off of the supply line where it was being manufactured, having them overnighted to our lab under a veil of secrecy, right? Doing frequency analysis on the chips, weighing the boards, looking at the dies and comparing them to a baseline die that we had, X-raying them as you'd already mentioned, right? And we did that, for a specific, a proprietary percentage of what was coming off the supply line. But the reason we were doing that was this particular company was supplying products for government agencies, right? So the risk tolerance was extremely low. You couldn't get that wrong. There was a lot of rumors about embeds and implants, stuff like that. So and a major manufacturer got hit with that, right? A supply chain plant that was discovered. This is all open source information. I always try not to say the company names myself just for my own benefit, but that's all out there. But the company that I was working at, we actually took great steps to ensure that the products they were manufacturing or any third party that was selling through us as a channel partner came through our lab. And we basically had the company sign an NDA that when they got their equipment back from our lab, it wouldn't be working anymore. Like we were going to melt that sucker down with everything that we had, right? And that was probably one of the most fun jobs I had because, if you always wondered, hey, what would happen if I did this thing? And, you actually had the opportunity to do that, right? And give them equipment that was basically melted when you were done with it.
Do we need to be more tamper-proof on the hardware side, or is it more about supply chain management?
I mean, we're all DEF CON family here. I think that the tamper-proof village is pretty well proof that tamper-proof products are a deterrence or a delay. They're not a guarantee that something's not going to happen. The visibility I have on the logistics process is not that great, but that would be where my biggest concern is. If you're looking at a determined adversary that wants to get a plant into your organization, right? The logistics capability is how that's going to happen, right? So if I'm sure with government agencies and such, there are methods for providing a chain of custody in the logistics, but that's a big organization that's got big budgets. What about the small medium business, the DIB partners, those guys that aren't part of that process, right? They're just as susceptible to those types of situations without any way to validate whether or not it's been done or not, right? So, and I think a lot of that, especially within like government organizations, right? Those events happening are going to be considered, need to know, probably won't be widely talked about, right? Because we don't, in some cases, those organizations won't want the adversary to know that was discovered, right? So it's a hard thing because I don't think information like that would be well broadcasted to worldwide public.
And to add to that, like all of the security controls when we're starting to talk about hardware, firmware, getting down to the X-ray, looking at implants, having chain of custody, like all of those are great ideas and should be done. But let's be real, at scale and at the speed in which technology is being developed, moved, and pushed, all those things become infeasible, and or they typically only last for the first part of that procurement, the follow-on, the warranty, the maintenance, the ongoing upkeep, the location. Each of those adds a risk vector and threat that you have to model, and depending on, US Gov's a great example. Like there are certain places that have very stringent models and very stringent threat models that they have to adhere to kind of protect against, but not all the places. So you really are as an organization, you're really trying to combat, what is a viable threat? What are the questions I can ask that fit within inside of my risk profile, as well as the resources, times, constraints, and budgets that allow us to do something about this when we're choosing and procuring hardware or vendors or cloud providers, or if we are one of those things, doing some of those due diligence pieces.
Yeah. And you know, one of the things that we talked about in a pre-show meeting, Paul, is something that's kind of a buzz. This is supply chain risk management related. It doesn't come off that way in the beginning, but there's a big buzz about reciprocity versus equivalency, right? So if you follow any of the stuff that's going on with DoD and CMC and all that stuff, right? But what does that actually mean, right? So if you are in an organization that decides, hey, we want to make sure that we're not making company do the same requirements for this organization as they're going to have to turn around and do the same thing for this organization, right? So organization B says, we're going to accept reciprocity from organization A. The problem with that is that if organization A ever changes something or matures their model, it invalidates everything that was reciprocal, right? Whereas if you have a equivalency, right, anything that gets changed or revoked on company A or organization A is not going to impact organization B and all its sub-organizations, right? So it goes back to supply chain risk management from an administrative side of the house with some of the things that Tyler just mentioned, right? You not only want to be aware of the manufacturer, you also want to have consistent methods of validating that they're meeting those requirements or not, right? And that's one effort that I've seen recently that's caused a lot of confusion, but it makes a whole lot of sense when you hear explained, hey, we're trying to future-proof this so that it can be matured, but we don't want it to be invalidated by another organization and their maturity process.
Yeah, I think it has to be dynamic because the nature of the supply chains that we're talking about are very dynamic. And we make comparisons to the food supply chain and other, supply chains. But I think the unique thing for the context of supply chain risk management in information technology is that everything changes, right? It can change. Sometimes the vendor themselves that's in the supply chain doesn't have to change anything. It's a security researcher that finds a vulnerability, and their stuff. So their stuff didn't change. What changed was some external entity found a problem, in your stuff. So I think that's a really interesting, aspect and challenge for this supply chain issues.
I think a fun one is talking about how do you report something to a cloud provider, like the big four, right? That's a given, right? But how do you identify the ownership or the usage of a cloud service offering when you can't identify who the owning IP is, right? DigitalOcean has fought this for years, right? But how do you do that, right? If you're a security researcher, you find something, how do you actually even report that and take action on it, right? That's definitely a current and future problem that is already happening.
Yeah, what are the specific challenges with that? Why are there challenges with cloud providers in disclosure today, David, in your opinion?
So I think it's a couple fold, right? Like at the end of the day, the cloud provider is a company, right? And they have razor thin margins because remember the thing that drove all of us to consuming commercial cloud was that maintaining your own data centers is expensive. It's a long process, especially you start getting into government organizations, stuff like that, right? So the cost of being in the data center business is extremely high. You'll see that most data center companies or colo companies are structured as real estate investment trusts. They're not even structured as technology companies, right? So at the forefront, their primary line of business is to lease or sell you a 1x1 grid square in their data center, right? There's all sorts of advantages to that, but there's also requirements that come with that. One, having to be vendor neutral, having to spend a specific percentage back into their company each year, right? But that is something that's offloaded even by the CSPs, right? CSPs don't have to build a whole bunch of data centers all over the place. They can have a colo somewhere, right? And the cost of leasing a colo space is a write-off is the cost of doing business, right? whereas the capital expense of building out a data center, right, is much different in how it hits their budgeting. I think one of the things that's come out and last year was the new SEC rule. And I think that's going to be a game changer. I mean, we've already seen over disclosure of information in those SEC reports, right? But having to provide what the material impact of an incident is, it's really eye-opening. One, for the people that went through it, but also for everybody else in the world of, that's trying to fight for budgeting within their cybersecurity departments, is saying, hey, look, this is what it costs this company, and they're a $3 billion a year company. Yeah, we're not a $3 billion a year company, but our impact is this, right? Like defining what that material impact would be. But when you ask me, what's the challenge in reporting? One, it's where do you report it? Not every company has a vulnerability disclosure program. Not everybody will just allow you from the outside to report something in, because there's a lot of people out there that do that maliciously, right? And then the ones that do are pretty darn busy, like actually trying to fact find and validate something before somebody wants to mic drop it and expose it to the public before they can fix it, right? So those are all competing things. Plus, that's not their primary focus, right? Their primary focus is the cloud service offering that they're trying to sell, and trying to do it at a competitive profit margin where they can stay ahead of their competition.
Yeah, it's interesting. There seems to be recent disputes over vulnerability disclosure to cloud providers, right? Microsoft just went through that, ended up fixing it in the end. And I'm not sure where all that stuff stems from, right? Or if it's even specific to cloud providers, but I think disclosure sometimes just goes down that path. And we often see the 1% that goes wrong rather than the 99% that it's getting fixed, and the communications are great and everyone's all on the same page and it's going great. We tend to only see the 1% that goes bad.
I think where that's going to get more challenging, though, is you're already seeing two major providers sitting down and saying, you know what, you should be able to run your workloads from my environment. I should be able to run your workloads from my environment. So they've come together and created products that allow you to do that, right? So that really creates a fun challenge of when you're trying to report something, you don't know if it's this provider or that provider or who to contact, right? You just know who is impacted, right? And the one that's impacted isn't able to drive being agent of change, right? Because of the shared responsibility matrix. They don't have visibility into that, right? They just know that what they're trying to do isn't working right now, and they're trying to figure out why. And at the end of the day, that's what they want, is why is this not like that? We trusted you to do these things. And I think that the big four, the big five, right? They're all doing great jobs of that. We've had great interactions with the big five at all the cons with their CTI teams, et cetera. I think they're all in the right direction, but they're not the only cloud providers, right? These SaaS providers, right? Like I've not seen a whole lot of action from a handful of major SaaS providers having CTI teams and trust and safety teams, right? Like those are all part of supply chain risk management when it comes to cloud services.
Also, I see those lines of responsibility being part of that debate, right? Where the cloud provider goes, well, I mean, we provided you with this, but customers need to secure it this way, or not. And that's the customer's responsibility, not the cloud provider's responsibility. So I still think there's a lot of blurred lines between whose responsibility is it for security and integrity of data and things like that.
Look how long we argued about the difference between breach versus incident versus event, right? Like as an industry, right? And then take the verbiage that got tossed around between lawyers, right? With reporting something post-discovery or post-declaration, right? In some cases, if something is allowed to be reported after declaration, meaning that multiple business units within an organization have assessed an incident, identified that it is actually an incident, and have declared it an incident, that is declaration. right? So from that point forward, the clock starts, right?
Mm-hmm.
But most reporting requirements say from discovery. Where that becomes a legal issue, right, is getting consensus that you have an incident, right? Incidents 101 is identify and validate that you have an incident, right? So, otherwise it's an event, otherwise it's a breach, right? Those are all legal terms that have a legal connotation. But whatever the law requires, you're going to always have a contractual requirement with those providers that obviously you have to agree upon it, but those contractual requirements can be more stringent than actually the legal requirement for reporting. So some of my current organization, some of our reporting requirements are actually within 1 hour of discovery, right? Third-party marketplace vulnerabilities have to be reported, not only reported, but with a mitigation strategy within 8 hours of discovery, right? So, those are some of the things that we are doing. Is it working 100%? No, there's a lot of things that we have to iron out. But fortunately, with my current organization, a lot of that stuff is subject to people requesting for that information. So, various levels of leadership across and outside of our organization are able to see those metrics. And that really helps be a change agent when we're trying to negotiate that stuff.
Tyler, did you have something? Because I want to go back to hardware, unless you had a question. I think I just want to go back to hardware for a moment, because I think that while more devastating, they're less frequently occurring attacks in this supply chain when it comes down to hardware and in physical things in meat space, right? But in terms of software and firmware, if an attacker, an adversary were to go after that, I think the targets are a little more juicy, maybe not as targeted, but when you start going after some of these more esoteric firmware providers that end up on chips that's on hardware, I think that's a problem we need to do better with and get ahead of a little more. What are your thoughts, David?
Well, I that's great until you've got an organization that's creating their own hardware, right? So they're not buying commodity, Dell, HP stuff, right, and putting it in their racks. They're actually rolling out a whole rack of custom hardware with their own configuration. So hopefully they're thinking about the chip issue, like working with companies like Intel and Eclipsium, right, for doing the things that you guys do. I'd love to see that when it gets published. Those big companies that are making their own hardware, I would hope that they are thinking about this problem, right? Because it's only a matter of time, right? Like insider threats are insider threats. Right?
Yeah.
If you think that you are security for obscurity.
What was that chip? There was a chip company that got breached. It didn't make a lot of headline news. We covered it on the show though. But they made chips. What are they called? We covered it on the show. But they were breached for like a year or more. And then they came out and said, "Oh, our supply chain is totally fine." I'm like, "All right, but okay, where are your chips going and who's using them?" How do we know? How do we know?
There was an issue with, I believe, NVIDIA got their hands smacked for exporting chips to an unauthorized location, right? That was a violation of, I think, ITAR restrictions, right? That was all in the news. That's a supply chain risk management issue, right? That that leads to loss of innovation and loss of a capability for certain organizations, right? But even to the fundamental level of that, right? Look at some of our near peer competitors and owning the raw materials, the majority of the raw materials for making chips, right? And I think that's one of the things that the CHIPS Act, which was passed last year, was really looking to alleviate, right? Bring some of that manufacturing capability back to home station, right? Working with our allied partners as well to do the same thing, where we're pulling some of that manufacturing back. I think the IOC, FOC state of that is probably 5 years from now. So, as long as we can be smooth sailing for 5 years, we can bring a lot of that manufacturing back. But then it becomes an argument about the control and access to the raw materials for those chips, right? Which also is a supply chain risk management issue.
Right. And I hope when we get there that we address some of the issues that I see today that we're working on here at Eclipsium, right? And that is, when I pull apart firmware, because I still do that from time to time, I'm like, if it's Linux-based firmware, and we're going to talk about this at length with Alan Friedman, I think next week or the week after. And when I look at the firmware, I'm like, your Linux software that you're using is years, I mean, sometimes a decade or more old. I'm like, how do we identify that, measure that, and add that into some kind of equation for how can I trust the supply chain for this firmware and software, right? And that should be a tick against them to go, oh, well, you're using Linux software that's like 8 years old. Like what? Okay, maybe it's not exploitable, and like I get the exploitable part of it, but still that's an indicator, right? And how do we pick up on more of these indicators and catalog them and bring them to light to help us figure out who to trust in the supply chain?
There's a sector, Paul, right, that while an organization is trying to prove their worthiness to be sold within that organization, right, during that accreditation window, they're not allowed to modify, update, change, do anything to the code. So by the time something rolls out as a program of record, right, it's already outdated, it's already old, it's not competitive, right? And the sector that happens in quite regularly is a pretty darn important one, right? So, their cloud doesn't necessarily solve that issue, because you also have that same, it's not just hardware that applies to, it's software as well, right? So, I think cloud enables that to be a quicker process and easier to go back and update and make changes versus redesigning an entire hardware stack, right? But it's still something that impacts supply chain risk management in that regard too.
Yeah, I think it's frustrating, for me, because I think there's solutions out there, and it's kind of a slow going to get them implemented. For example, on the firmware side, I mean, in embedded systems, IoT devices, creating an SBOM with that is, I mean, it's built into the tool chains now, right? And we got to foster adoption, and Linux organizations that are supporting Linux Free Software Foundation and the like are pushing that, but it's slow going. I mean, there's a lot of software and firmware out there that can benefit from this process, but there's a lot of it, and getting people around.
I love the work that Alan Friedman is doing with CISA. There's a number of us that have left really successful private sector careers and decided to, jump in full throttle with, government agencies and bring that experience to bear. And, you talk about going in and basically spitting into the wind, right? Like, you're talking about something that completely nobody understands, and he's making so much progress with that. Like, I'd venture to say, like, nobody was even saying the word SBOM 2 or 3 years ago, and now everybody's like, all right, how are we going to do this?
Yeah,
right.
That's the conversation I just had with Alan. Yes.
Yeah, he's awesome. I love him.
Anything else you want to share with our audience, David, on SBOMs or supply chain risk management?
No, I'm good. I think you covered it all. Hopefully people don't lose sleep at night.
Well, David, thank you very much for appearing on this episode of Eclipsium's Below the Surface, done in partnership with the Cyber Risk Alliance. So, David, thank you again.
Likewise, thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.